Hey guys, we're back with True EV episode 6, and this is an episode where we're going to continue our foray through river play. In particular today, we're going to look at some weird and wonderful river spots that we're not going to be prepared for through drills or looking at sims or anything like that. These are going to be spots that we have to figure out on the fly. They're a bit too unique, really, for us to have any preparation that's meaningful for them. So we have to draw upon our hand reading skills, our experience, our awareness of what's going on, and of course our understanding of the true EV of our options. So I thought these hands would be very suitable for this part of the series. So we have Queen 10 here in the big blind, and this is definitely a hand that you would look at and think I was a complete whale, like an utter fish, if you saw me play this hand. You would think that I had no idea how to play poker. And in a sense, you would be right, because during this hand, I was four-tabling, as I am doing in this 100 Russian cast challenge, trying to get the volume in, because I don't have a whole lot of time to play at the minute as we're leading up to this subscription service dropping. And when you're four-tabling, sometimes you forget the action, or you can't quite remember how you got to a street. It's quite rare for me to do that, but if I am playing like my B game, or I'm not like fully awake or switched on, it can definitely happen. And in this hand, it happened because we check called a big bet here from a recreational. I had a few other hands going on at the same time. But when I looked at this bet, I remember thinking, okay, big bet on King Jack 3 from a rec player. This is going to be pretty strong. This is going to be equity driven. The bluffs are going to be mainly draws and stuff here. There's a possibility that like random hands c-bet for this sizing as well, but it's much less likely that people are c-betting 5s or 7s or ace 4 for this sizing or ace 9. And much more likely that you're looking at King 10 plus and higher equity stuff in the draw department. So I think call is better than raise here. When you raise here, your fold equity will be a lot less than it's meant to be. Implied odds and fold equity are in a way inversely proportionate, in that because we have a lot of implied odds in this spot, meaning we think villain's range is quite strong and we think we're going to get paid off if we hit straight, we also have less fold equity, because if we raise, well, villain's range is quite strong, and we're not going to get the raise through as frequently as we would in theory. So not only should you be decreasing your raise frequency generally and strategically in GTO against the bigger sizing, but in practice is a more poignant exploitative reason to actually prefer call to raise here. So the true EV of call is no doubt higher than the true EV of raise here. Yet, you know, you'll see people mixed and not really think about this spot enough and get lazy. So that's why we're here making this series. The 8 of spades on the turn, and we donk overbet because we're an absolute end boss, and this is a play that is so advanced that, you know, you could only make it if you're very, very, very good at poker. In reality, you know, I jest here, but in reality, this play is very bad because we're leading into, theoretically, we're leading into a polarized range. I would say that, like, if you built this around exactly pocket 8s and... would you even call flop with pocket 8s here? Maybe not. But if you built it around exactly some nutted hand like that you didn't raise on flop, and a few bluffs, like maybe it's okay, but probably not, because if you have a good hand here, you want your opponent to bluff the turn with the low EV stuff. So in theory, it's just awful. In practice, I want to say that it's pretty bad as well, because we know villain's range is just really strong here. We're probably going to not be garnering that much fold equity here from top pair plus and high equity draws, and that is what villain probably normally has. And so this play was made because I thought I was the turn barreler for some reason, just for a split second at a moment of insanity where I thought I was double barreling. And had I bet the flop here as the cutoff, you know, against the big blind or something like that, or had I been probing the turn, that would be the other thing that I maybe thought happened. Like the overbet would be fine in both of those situations because we would have the big nut advantage. The uncapped versus capped paradigm would be in play in both of those spots, both the probe spot and the turn barrel. But here, of course, that is not the case. We are the one with the capped range and should be checking and trying to survive and having to check fold a lot of our range and to big bets in theory, and having to call at 0 EV with the right bluff catchers and stuff like that, and having to raise almost never. So that's the GTO outlook here. In reality, I think it's going to be quite grim as well if we check. It's even worse now because we've done this in villain raises. This is a pure implied odds problem. It's not just a pot odds problem, of course. We want to think about how much we make on a 9 or ace river. I don't think a flush draw is very likely to raise here at all, even with a king in it. I know recreational players overvalue pair plus draw, but I think this is almost exclusively just going to be 2 pair plus sets, maybe pocket aces, ace king, something like that. The moral of this hand is that when your implied odds are very good, your fold equity is very low. Jam here would be very terrible indeed. There's basically 0 fold equity or close to it against this line in reality. And fold isn't really on the cards either, because we only have to invest another 18 big blinds into a pot that by the river could be 200 bigs, and a lot of that's coming from our opponent. So if you imagine that we get our opponent's stack most of the time by donk jamming a straight river, and I would just simply donk jam a straight river into a bluffless, really strong range. This is the true EV part. We don't actually want to check river here. You don't want to fall into the trap of just lazily checking river once you call this, because villain will check back on certain cards may check back with ace king on a 9 river. Villain may check back a set on a flush river, that kind of thing. So I think donk jamming rivers here, especially if they're hearts, is a really good idea and is paramount to the EV of this turn call. But yeah, we are easily getting enough odds here to mine this sort of 16% equity, given that, you know, although our pot odds here are 21%, the implied odds, the amount of this stack that we make on average, is going to take us above this threshold. So it's always important to remember that this is not just a pot odds problem, it's also implied odds, as basic as that may sound. We bink the ace of hearts. This being a heart, very unlikely now that villain is going to jam river with something like king jack. They're going to check back a lot here. They're going to be very worried about this visually. They're going to take the opportunity to check back frequently here. Some players will just steamroll ahead here with a set, but a lot of people will check back, and therefore donk jam is absolutely mandatory. This is a spot where if you routinely check, you are decimating your true EV completely. It's an amazingly large amount of big blinds better to jam here than it is to check, even though it's a donk and it's into a range that raised you earlier and all of that stuff. This is the play. We do get called here by the set of jacks, so basically exactly what we thought was going on. And the moral of this story is, if you're going to mess up a hand horribly, at least redeem yourself by getting the next couple of notes right. So hope you enjoyed that one. On to another weird and wonderful GG pokerism, which is of course the splashed pot. We have jack 10 offsuit here in the big blind, and there's a limp from the hijack. So we go ahead and check here. This is interesting already. You could convince me that raise was right here, because a lot of the recreational players on GG are wanting to see the splash pot at all costs, and their range for limping here can be incredibly wide. Incredibly wide. There could be a few traps in here, but by and large this could just be anything. So already bumping this up to like 14 big blinds or something like that could be a really nice play. It does reopen action, and getting jammed on when you have jack 10 offsuit is a real disaster and means that your equity realization is just stopped dead. But you could convince me that raise is right here. We did check. I'm not sure what I think of that now. Might be a mistake. So we checked flop, just giving the limper the chance to start stabbing. They bet 9.75 big blinds. If this weren't a splashed pot, then I would be very tempted to say that this sort of sizing into two opponents is pretty strong. And again, I think it will usually be equity driven here, even in the splash pot, but because splash pots do strange things to people and make them kind of greedy, they feel like compelled to get the money in the middle, which I guess is what the site wants you to feel, then this could be a bit wider. So I think, you know, a kind of meh call, not a very, very happy call, but not a sad call either. Just calling here with a medium strength hand is the best play. We're checking. Villain's checking back. Note that we're not thinking about our range at all. We're not getting lost in the weeds of planning our strategy. We are simply trying to maximize hand versus range, which is the premise of this way of thinking. Very powerful way of thinking that is true EV. And now on the river, we have a very important true EV decision here. First off, just to make a claim, the chances that checking and betting are the same EV here are extremely low. In theory, it will probably not be a big deal whether you go for a small bet with a hand like this or whether you check. And the fact that villain big bet the flop, in theory, if there is a theory of a splash pot, will mean that you want to value bet smaller and thinner with hands like this on the river. Or, well, smaller and less thin, I should say. You want to check more, you want to bet small, instead of betting big, because your opponent's range polarized on turn. In real life, with this being like a drawy board, it's extremely unlikely that we're beat here. Not extremely unlikely, I mean villain can have like 8s or something, or queen 10, or possibly like queen jack, but it's really quite unlikely against a recreational player when turn goes check check that we're losing here. So I think our equity is very high, but when your equity's high and you're trying to figure out the right line in terms of true EV, you need to ask yourself why your equity is high. Is our equity really high because we think our opponent has a ton of combos like 9x or jack 5? No, not really. We think our equity is really high here because our opponent has a lot of nothing, because they limped in a splashed pot and then just stabbed the flop and checked the turn. So if you think your opponent's range is quite air heavy here, and ace high and king high heavy, stuff like this, then probably check or tiny bet becomes right on the river. Now, the upside of tiny bet, of betting like, I don't know, 20% pot, is that you get a bit of EV from 9x or 8x or 10-8 or queen 9 or something like that that you might not get by checking when villain checks back a lot. The downside is that you probably get bluffed less. I don't think people are raising in big blinds or 8 big blinds or 5 big blinds as often as they're betting against check. I think that's just normal. Like, yeah, sometimes you'll induce when you bet small, but I've always found bet small to induce like a really problematic thought process, because by betting small, very often you're decreasing the amount of the time your opponent will attack you compared to if you check. So check to induce is, in my mind, a bit more meaningful, especially if your tiny bet's only going to be 3 big blinds or something, like it's not really harvesting much value in EV. Then check seems right here to me. So I'm pretty confident that check is by far the best play against a range that lands way too wide and could potentially be dramatically overbluffing. If villain is limping hands pre-flop here, like 5-4 suited, 6-4 suited, ace-7 off, king-6 suited, etc., there's no end to the amount of combos that they could bluff on this river. They could literally be overbluffing this river by like 7-1 or something. So when we face this, you should be extremely happy. This is a fist pump call. We're winning so often here that I almost want to click it back and see if I can get them to jam. But it's not quite that much. That would be crazy. I wouldn't actually do that. But yeah, I think we're winning 80% of the time on a node where we need 30% equity. And this is why exploitative poker is so key to win rate, because you are winning 2 to 3 times more often than you need to be in many spots. That's absolutely insane. Like, our hand at this point against this sizing in GTO should be close to a bluff catcher. But in real life, it's beating almost all of villain's range. And it maybe is still a bluff catcher, although I suspect that people will sometimes merge like Jack 5 here and stuff as well. And we obviously win against that, with the 9 being the highest kicker card there with the 2 pair. So I think we should certainly call, but just take a minute to appreciate just how amazing it is to call here and how important it was to check here. Even though we had a ton of equity, our opponent's range was massively air heavy. So the true EV lesson here is that when your opponent's range contains mostly air, and that's why your equity is really high, checking can be way better than value betting. You don't have to value bet out of position just because you can, because trap checking and inducing and getting an air-filled range to bluff too much can just be a way better play. The deuce 4 offsuit speaks for itself. We don't really have to say anything else here. Point proven. Not to be results oriented, but yeah, splash pots are chaotic sometimes. Bear that in mind if you do play volume on GG. This hand features a 4-bet pot with queen, queen, and I think the important lesson here is that remembering what configuration you're in and what your opponent's starting range roughly looks like is paramount to your success when you're making true EV choices and hand reading. A lot of people go wrong when they're hand reading because they think they need to put villain on some exact range, and they start listing combos. You can have this, this, and this. You can have ace king, you can have ace 5. You can have aces, you can have kings. And it's like, okay, in a 4-bet pot, maybe that makes a bit more sense because the range is smaller, it's easier to work with, and you can kind of apprehend it by consciously listing hands. But when you're in most poker situations, like late position, 6 max cash, single raised or 3-bet pots, ranges are so vast combinatorically that trying to list it explicitly like this is just not going to be the best way to go. Rather, it's going to be better to just build a vague subconscious feel of something. Just like in life when you're playing a sport, you're not thinking about where every atom of a hockey ball is when you're hitting the hockey ball. You might wonder why I'm saying ball for hockey. There's a sport called field hockey or like normal hockey that's not ice hockey as well, by the way, just if you're wondering. That exists. So, you know, if you're hitting a hockey ball or a golf ball or you're throwing a basketball into a hoop or whatever, you are subconsciously processing already where the location of things are. And you're able to coordinate yourself and the ball and the golf club and the world. You're able to coordinate yourself with all of those things without having to think about it precisely, without having to list the location of the hoop, the location of the golf ball, how many inches the golf club is from the ground as you're placing it, as you're coordinating it and getting ready to swing. You just don't need to do any of that. And in poker, you don't need to list the range exactly because when you've been playing poker for long enough, you just have a very good vague feel of what this range looks like. So if you ask me what that range is, I can probably list ace 4, ace 5, ace king, a bit of queens, but we block it heavily, kings, aces, some other bluffs occasionally like king jack suited. I can start listing these hands, but it's more just that I have a vague feel for it that's enough and is subconscious and is more workable. You can work with it more because it's not so clumsy and granular. So I think call is the way to go here. Honestly, this is underbluffed from pre-flop in this pool, in these positions when it's 19 here. Like, people just are not going to have enough combos of suited Broadway here. They're going to fall into the trap of calling them too often instead of 4-betting them. So queens is in worse shape than it should be. Jamming pre here is a mistake in GTO and is an abominable play in real life. It's very, very bad in a pool like this that's kind of a bit softer. In this game, you know, you're not battling that many tough players. You do have some regs, but you're mainly playing against people you have a big edge against, and you're trying to destroy them post-rake. So you have to make a lot of exploits, basically, in a game like 100 Russian Cash. If you're playing even lower, it's even more true. So we call the flop, which is normal. The turn is the 4 of spades. Villain checks. This line is quite interesting. Now, there's a few things that are happening here. One is that if I bet the turn and get jammed on, especially with these two queens, blocking flushes, but just in general here, I'm going to be really unhappy in this pool. In GTO, I have no doubt that if I bet the turn, I meant to call a shove, and I meant to do it with like quite considerable winning chances. Like I'm going to be plus EV there considerably. But in this landscape, what's happening is that villain is occasionally slow playing aces or kings. The ones with the spade and the diamond are meant to slow play more than the heart club sort of combinations, but that's neither here nor there. I think in real life, this is really ace king weighted. I think tiny bet's good here. I don't think villain's that likely to bluff the river. I think embracing the jam sometimes, and I don't know, I guess you'd have to fold. My only reservation with tiny bet in game of betting like third pot or quarter pot here was that if I get jammed on, I might sometimes be folding to like ace king or something that's just like tilt jamming. I figured if I check back, obviously the downside is that it's not that I lose value, because I don't think I've got two streets of value against ace king here very often. But one issue with checking back here is that we just allow villain to realize when they have a hand like ace king and they have two overcards, and they could be free rolling us in the sense that they're not putting any more money in the pot if we check unless they hit, and if they do hit, they are putting money in the pot. That said, I think on an ace or a king river, we have a really easy fold against this pool. I just don't think there's going to be any bluffs. I don't think they're 4-betting anything that could bluff there. Even ace 5 and ace 4 have got there in some sense and are unlikely to bluff now. The 4 being trips and the 5 just being showdown value. So I think overall, betting small on this turn is probably the right line, just because we clean up a bit of equity and get a bit of value from ace king, which is overwhelmingly what our opponent's going to have here. When they check the river, and we do fade the ace or the king, thankfully here, though I think I prefer turn bet. I just don't think like checking back to induce any bluffs in this situation is going to be good, because most of the time, villain doesn't have enough of the combos of king queen suited, king jack suited, king 10 suited. Maybe they have some, and maybe checking back is like not horrendous, and I would call most sizes here on river probably still, but I wouldn't call all in from this pool or like an overbet. I just don't think that in this configuration you're being bluffed anywhere near often enough. They're just going to have aces or kings if they go all in here too frequently. But they check, and now it's a bit of a blood from a stone spot, I think. Now, the options here, obviously we should bet because I think we have the best hand almost always. If we bomb it, I think our fold equity is very, very high. Ace king might hero us though in this spot, and that's what I neglected to think about in game here. I didn't consider the ace king is actually just beating bluffs and has a lot of showdown here and can easily just call a bigger bet. And I think I made a mistake here. I went for like an inducey line where I thought, well, villain has nothing most of the time, but they might have ace 5 sometimes. They might have ace king and they might hero with it. And who knows, like it's not impossible that they have like some weird other bluff catcher sometimes, like ace 9 suited, or I guess that's really rare now, right? But like jacks or something, that seems rare. But probably going a bit bigger here is good. I don't like going all in. I think that would be terrible. I don't like going pot. But I think something like B60 here, B50, is an improvement. I think ace king can bluff catch these sizes pretty readily. It can bluff catch this size as well, of course. But I don't know. People probably overfold to this size, honestly. People need to defend so often here that if they just talk themselves into thinking that you're milking them or inducing them, they can just fold their ace king to this size. There are even people who fold ace king to this size but call a bigger bet. So I guess what I'm saying is I think this is underly elastic between this sizing and a bigger sizing with respect to the ace king part of villain's range, which is 16 combinations, and it's basically their whole range at this point, let's face it. I'm not normally one to put villain on one hand, but villain has ace king in this spot more often than they have any other hand. Like all the other hands collectively, I should say. So we did actually run into the fold here. This could just be like a give up, like a king jack of hearts that's giving up now, and there's not much we can do against that. And this line is right against King Jack of Hearts. In fact, we'd probably want to go even smaller and just reopen for some token gesture that allows villain to bluff. But yeah, I think it's mostly Ace King here, and I think we should go bigger and still get bluff caught a lot by that. So I think this is a mistake. But yeah, you know, this is true EV. I'm not always going to find the right true EV line when I'm four tabling. I'm going to make errors, and I think it's important that I show you those as well and show you where I can be improving as I work my way through this challenge and indeed work my way through recording this series for you guys on Carrot Corner. I like to peel prosperous implied odds heavy hands, especially when I'm deep with multiple weaker players. I think this was just like a not very good, like tight semi-fish reg kind of player that opened here, and there was a weaker player in the big blind, I think, as well. One that's on a heater, as you can see here, 954. It's quite the stack, 100 Russian cash. This is just another spot where I think just thinking in a vacuum, understanding what's going on with your hand against their range or ranges is key to success. So we go for a check on this flop here, and we decide to call, which I think is right. Raising this unnutty draw three-way doesn't really make a lot of sense here in true EV terms, because we actually want this player to call with a 9. Because the thing is, if we're already losing to this player, which usually we are, and usually, you know, when they bet three-way here, they have something, and we will usually need to improve to win, although there might be some bluff opportunity that's reasonable later. But we usually have to improve to win, so having the other guy in the pot here, boosting our implieds and our pot odds just makes a ton of sense for this hand. I think call is better than raise here very clearly, even though in theory you could do either play. It's important to have a preference. It's very important, as you're seeing in this series, to allow yourself the room to judge what's better. So instead of just being like, oh, either plays fine, give yourself the room to explore it. Give yourself a bit of time and think about it. It will not be the same EV in real life. It's almost impossible. Sometimes it's close and it doesn't matter. But yeah, here, I think raise just doesn't return enough fold equity. It's not so clear what we're saying we have. I guess like a slow played set or something. But I don't think raise is going to do amazingly well here at all. We have two ranges that could be very uncapped. This one is less likely to be uncapped than this one. But yeah, I think going after this and raising doesn't make sense. I think there's enough implied odds here to easily peel this. I think we're very unlikely to get raised by this player, so the fact we're not quite closing action here is not a huge deal. This has to just be a call and lead river if we get there. And again, why are we leading river if we get there? And why are we leading the spade river smaller than the straight river? Because it's harder to be paid on the spade river. People are just not going to be paying off massive bets three-way here too frequently unless they're like absolute fish. And this is just like semi-rec, semi-reg player. So the right line here is call and then just lead small on a spade because you have a thin value bet for the circumstances actually, or thin-ish. And on a straight card, on the 6, you just go big. You just lead a bit bigger. I think on a 6, we're just leading kind of big-ish here, but not huge. And on a flush card, we're leading small. But leading is definitely tantamount to this play being fine. You're getting enough pot odds and implied odds here for sure. So yeah, just peeling. This is fine. Although there's some risk now that we're actually running into bigger flush draws. This is another problem. Like maybe turn is a fold. Maybe. Just because this player's in the pot and has a lot of bigger flush draws and no smaller ones really. Apart from 6-4 of spades. So you could convince me that turn is a fold. But I think it's okay at these pot odds. I think it's okay. We do get the Dream River. Unfortunately, it's a diamond. I'd rather the 6 of clubs or hearts, but beggars can't be choosers. We just called turn with a flimsy draw, so let's lead. We find the sizing that we think is right. They do both fold here, which is understandable because like this is a very unbluffed spot. But I think if we check, the problem is that they're not going to value bet any of the hands that fold to this river bet, I wouldn't think. And therefore we don't gain anything in that respect by checking, and they're going to underbluff so horribly here. That check call is just not a good line compared to betting. If you can bet with recreational players in the pot and you can bet for value and you think they're going to be very straightforward if you check like they will in a spot like this, you should just bet. I'm a big fan of this play against recreational players. Obviously, against strong players, this is a bit goofy and you could debate whether it even makes any sense and they're going to be bluffing more often and maybe you just check and take your medicine there. But yeah, against rec players, I think you definitely want to be going ahead and leading this river for sure. Very important stuff to consider which line is actually best. Okay, final hand, we have jacks and we open the cutoff. We are raised to 8 big blinds by the small blind and we peel. Flop is 10-6 deuce monotone. This is another weird and wonderful spot that you can't really prep for too easily. It doesn't come up very often. You've got to figure it out with your in-game skills, your battle-hardened experience. We call the flop on 10-6 deuce mono. Villain checks the turn and we check. I think this hand's a bit too good to turn into a bluff on the turn. I did consider a line like bet jam, with the idea that like all of the queens through aces with no spade, which are quite likely now, are probably folding. If I go tiny on turn and just bet river bigger, I probably don't need to bet jam actually. I could maybe go like 7 big blinds and then just bet river bigger. That's probably an okay line. Yeah, turning jacks into a bluff here is not too absurd, but in game I missed it and I just checked. I think I considered it briefly, but didn't really entertain it. And then on the river here, the thing is, this is a gross spot because, well, clearly you shouldn't fold because we know from Grady of the Carrot Poker School, if you haven't checked out that course, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's one of the most valuable things we've produced at Carrot Corner in recent times. Grady is all about MDA, mass data, what lines mean. There are 2 data points here that make this overbluffed. The first one is that you have a rec player taking a small sizing. And it's not that they think this is third pot, that they think they're block betting here. It's just they are comfortable bluffing for 10 bigs. Small bets are more bluff to value wise than big bets from rec players in many spots, even though the opposite should hold in theory. So small sizing like this is a very overbluffed thing. It's meant to only be bluffed a fifth of the time, and you know it's going to be bluffed way more. Ace King of Clubs is going to do this like at some decent frequency, that sort of thing. The other reason that you should definitely call here is that when the aggression is scattered and it's 4 flush, it's very, very overbluffed because most of the time the value hands are just betting the turn. I'll also point out that a recreational player doesn't 3-bet a lot of hands pre that contain the 8 or 9 of spades or 5 of spades. So they're not going to have a weak flush very often. They either have like the jack of spades plus, which is very likely to bet the turn, or bet bigger on the river, or they have nothing. Sometimes you'll call here and you're going to lose to like kings because they have no concept of what they're doing and they're just block betting kings. So maybe that's not so horrible actually. But you have to just accept that, I think. I don't think raise is right here. It's just a bit too expensive against like the queen of spades, jack of spades, stuff that people get a bit nitty with. I don't think it's right at all. I don't think fold makes any sense. This is just clearly a call. And it's important not to get too repulsed by your absolute hand strength in spots like this. We've talked about this concept a lot throughout the series so far. No doubt it will come up time and time again. But yeah, think about whether spots are overbluffed or underbluffed. And remember what that means. When you're saying this is underbluffed or overbluffed, you're using a value bluff ratio of 80 to 20 as your baseline. Because he bet third pot, you need 20% required equity. That's why if he's bluffing 35% of the time here, it's grossly overbluffed. So remember that, right? It's the ratio matters. The pot odds matter. They set the parameters for what it means to say that something is overbluffed or underbluffed. The final thought I'll conclude with is that sometimes I hear poker players say this is underbluffed, but they don't actually know what that means in terms of frequency. Look at the pot odds. Look at the data points. Forget your absolute hand strength. Go from there. I hope you enjoyed this episode of True EV. Lots more to come, and thank you for subscribing to Carrot Corner. See you next time.